Hey everybody, welcome back. I have another video for you. Thank you for the support as always. If you are watching this as a free video, please consider going over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Dreitzer. You can find a whole bunch more videos just like this one and a lot more commentaries and some of my other writings and poetry and much more. So thank you for those of you who have already decided to support me there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the developments in recent days. I'm going to focus on a couple of key issues, and then I'm going to switch to the food issue, which is, of course, very, very critical as the months tick away here and as we get closer to the fall, and when the issues with food and food prices are going to be exacerbated even more. But before we get to that, let's talk about some of the military developments and what's been happening around Odessa. Odessa, of course, is in the news if you're following the war, if you haven't been totally distracted by the other shiny objects that everybody's paying attention to, not to obviously not to demean any of the other horrific developments in other areas that we've been following in recent weeks. But if you're still paying attention to this war, as I assume you are if you're listening to me, then you probably know that there has been an increase in attacks around Odessa. As I'm recording here on the morning of July 1st, we are reading the news of yet another war crime carried out by the Russians, this time an attack on Odessa, or rather in the region of Odessa, which hit a residential building. At least 19 confirmed dead, among whom two of whom are children. This was an apartment building and a recreation center in the town of Serhivka, which is 80 kilometers or about 50 miles south of Odessa. So, if from the port, rather. So, this is obviously horrific to think about. Everyone who's listening, I'm sure, has ways of, trying to put out of their minds what it must be like to sort through rubble and find dead children and things like that. But in thinking about this from a purely political perspective, I think that there's a couple of different developments that need to be brought together to get a better picture of what the Russians are doing here. Because while the Russians are obviously war criminals here and are the aggressors in carrying out war crimes, it's not as if there's not some logic generally to some of what they do. So let's talk a little bit about some of these issues. I mentioned just in the last 24, 48 hours that these strikes on Odessa, but that has to also be seen sort of in tandem with or as a reaction to some of the other developments in the region. So back about a week ago, maybe a little bit more now, I think it was June 24th or 25th, there was an attack on a Russian gas platform in the Black Sea. This was, I mean, there was definitely news about this. It wasn't like it was buried, but with so many other developments, I think it was easy to miss. This attack was carried out by Ukrainians with three simultaneous missile strikes. Those missiles were likely some of the missiles supplied by Ukraine's Western allies. So this created a huge fire. So it hits the platform, creates a fire, and that then raises the additional risk of the pipeline itself, the pipeline from the platform, then catching on fire and creating a much bigger disaster. So the Russians, from media reports, the Russians claimed that they shut off the gas pipelines as soon as the fire had begun to rage in order to prevent that scenario from happening. So this platform was or is roughly 70 kilometers off the coast of Crimea. Remember, Crimea is, at least according to Russia, part of Russia. Okay, so Crimea, as you know, this annexed territory that the Russians now claim as their own. I mean, we're talking about an attack very close to Russian territory here, and this is not just shooting over the border from Ukraine and into the city of Rostov or something. This is directly targeting economic infrastructure, gas platform. Now, I'm going to get to why that's important in a second. The three platforms that were targeted simultaneously, so three missiles, three platforms all struck simultaneously. I mentioned the pipelines were shut down for fear of a wider fire. So, in other words, the Russians have now announced all production in the Odesa gas field to be suspended. This is significant. The Black Sea is a major resource for the Russians, for Russian energy. So, if the Russians are now feeling insecure in what amounts to their own backyard, as it were, I think this then gets at the heart of some of these military developments, because while we see every day the Russians gaining ground in Donbass, moving to encircle this town or that town, consolidate their control over Luhansk, over Donetsk, etc., we have in other parts of the country a seesaw battle going back and forth, as we see here with Odessa and the area around Odessa and in the Black Sea. So the military situation is complicated because it really depends on what part of the country you're looking at, and it depends on how much you want to read into some of the strategy here. This, of course, what I just mentioned, the attack on the gas platforms, which happens a week and change ago, this then leads us to talking or thinking about the other development that people have been talking about in recent days, and that is the Russian, you could call it strategic withdrawal, you could call it escape from this Snake Island, as it's known. Snake Island was made sort of infamous in the very early days of Russia's invasion when, allegedly these, Ukrainian armed forces refused to surrender to the Russians and were blown to pieces, only to then be later found out that that wasn't exactly what happened. But anyway, this strategic island, which had been controlled by Ukraine up until, the early part of this war, the Russians had essentially taken control over Snake Island, and now they have been pushed back out. They claim they withdrew strategically. That's not entirely clear. But what this really tells us is that Ukraine has made a successful offensive against Russian military interests, not just, not like guerrilla tactics, but direct military confrontation with Russia around Odessa and around the Black Sea coast. Because while the Russians may have utterly destroyed Mariupol, including the port at Mariupol, they do not control the rest of the coastline. They need to be able to control Odessa in order to have full control over the Black Sea. So the fact that the Ukrainians counterattacked and drove the Russians out was obviously a humiliation for the Russians. I mean, that's clear, despite whatever bluster they may want to use. It's clearly a humiliation for the Russians. And so, within 2 days, we see the Russians making these indiscriminate, or what look like indiscriminate, missile attacks on the Odessa region. So I mean, I hate to call it tit for tat, considering how the significance and seriousness of what's happening here. But it is essentially a kind of tit for tat, retribution on top of retribution, right? The Russians had no business invading Ukraine in the first place, committing these monstrous war crimes. The Ukrainians have fought back. The Russians consolidate control, and the Ukrainians push back. And now the Russians punish them for having won at least that small battle over Snake Island. So this is part of the broader struggle, is what I'm saying. So when we see, a missile striking in the central part of the country, or when we see a missile strike on a recreation center near Odessa, or when we see, shelling in Kharkiv region, all of these things are different aspects of the war, and they're not all, on the same page with each other. That is to say, progress may be made by the Russians in one area, the Ukrainians successfully counterattacking in another area. This is the nature of the drawn out war. And this is why, I mean, it's not that we want to find meaning where there might not be any, but this is why we have to read a little bit more carefully when we read each and every story coming out of Ukraine. A missile attack on a residential building in the Odessa region isn't the only story. Obviously, you have to see it in context with other things that have happened leading up to that to understand, yes, the Russians are carrying out collective punishment, but it is not for no reason. They just lost territory over here, or they just miscalculated over here, or what have you. Anyway, I think you all get the point. I don't want to ramble, as some as one of my wonderful patrons let me know on my last video that I was rambling a little too much. So let me not do that. Um, so Izium and Chugiv, two towns near in the Kharkiv region, have had massive shelling in recent days. 4 dead, 3 wounded. At least that's what's confirmed. There's probably more than that. We also have continued Russian shelling in significant shelling near and around the town of Lysychansk. This is again part of Russia's broader strategy to consolidate control over really all of Donbass. So the question of whether or not the Russians are going to be able to control Donbass, that remains open. But whether or not they're going to push forward in consolidating control over territory seems pretty much a foregone conclusion. What I mean to say is, when we read about what the Russians are doing in Donbass, there's two ways that we need to read it. On the one hand, yes, the Russians are steamrolling slowly but surely Ukraine's armed forces, and yes, they're consolidating control over territory. But what exactly is going to happen in that territory moving forward? Do we really believe that all of Donbass is going to be purely pacified by the Russians? There's not going to be any kind of an insurgency. There's not going to be any, house to house urban style warfare that's going to have to be carried out. Of course, there is. This war is not simply a war over territory. There is so much more to it, and I think the Russians understand that. It's part of the reason why the Russians are willing to start making deals, including some of these prisoner exchanges that we've read about recently. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off subject here. I guess what I would leave you with on this subject before I switch over to the food issue is that the attacks on the gas platforms in the Black Sea, by the Ukrainians, the attacks by the Russians on civilian infrastructure, these buildings, the recreation centers, etc. Whether or not you think the Russians are doing that deliberately or not, the war crime is the war crime, irrespective of what the intention was. And so, what we need to understand is that these things are connected. It is part of a back and forth struggle. And unfortunately, as we all understand, regular, ordinary men, women, and children end up in the middle and end up buried beneath the goddamn rubble. All right. Let me switch over to talking a little bit about food here. I've mentioned the food issue many times before. I'm certainly not the only one who's been raising raising alarms over this. Really, from the beginning of this war, it was very, very clear to me that this was going to be one of the central issues as the months carried on. Now, there was some debate over whether or not this war would be quick or not. I said it would definitely end up as a long slog once the Russians clearly could not blitzkrieg their way to Kiev and carrying out regime change. So, really, from almost the beginning of the conflict, it was fairly obvious that food and wheat, especially, and fertilizers and things like that, agricultural products, were going to become a major, major issue globally. Russia being the dominant player in wheat production and fertilizer production that it is. Ukraine being this outsized giant wheat exporter, I believe number 4 or 5 in the world, behind Russia and several other countries. So this was clearly going to be a problem. Now, I want to just talk through some of what Putin's claims are. Because I don't want to just rehash this issue every time. I don't want to talk about all aspects of it. If you want to go back to some of the other videos that I've done talking about this, especially as it relates to the global South, please go ahead and do that. But Putin recently came out and made some pretty interesting statements or claims with regard to this, and I think it's clear because Putin is beginning to, if already feel pressure, global pressure, both from international institutions like the United Nations, but also from some of his own allies in the global South, that, hey, this war in Ukraine is really going to devastate us. And just side note, I've said that in my opinion, it would be really shocking if the global food crisis doesn't lead to multiple governments being collapsing. I think that's very clear. Sri Lanka is an example. It's not a food crisis. It is a debt and economic crisis generally. But Sri Lanka, I think, is a good example of a country whose government has basically totally collapsed, and one that has collapsed to a large extent in response to some of these global developments from coronavirus and supply chains and China and other things, right? So I believe that we will see other countries, especially ones that are already teetering on the brink of political turmoil, places like Sudan, Lebanon, Ethiopia, elsewhere, places that are heavily dependent on these wheat imports that are very much at risk of potential political disaster. So, with that said, I believe that Putin is probably hearing it from some of his allies and people internationally. And so he felt forced to come out and make some pretty bold claims with regard to Russia and Russia's alleged culpability in creating this food crisis. So, claim number one by Putin that the Russians have placed no restrictions on the export of fertilizer or food. Well, that is true and untrue simultaneously. It's true in the sense that Russia is not exactly holding back the exports. They are not forbidding export of wheat or fertilizer. Obviously, these are two huge sources of revenue for the country, but rather that Russia is more or less responding to sanctions, right? So Putin is basically transferring the guilt here, transferring blame. It's not our fault that the West put sanctions on us. Well, that's clearly objectively true. Putin is obviously correct that sanctions are a major aspect of this, but the idea that the sanctions somehow, absolve Putin of culpability for this is laughable. So he says there's no restrictions on export of fertilizer or food. He also says that Russia doesn't block the export of Ukrainian wheat. Now, this is very interesting. Putin is basically making the claim that Russia hasn't stopped the Ukrainians from selling their wheat. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are saying, but wait a second. You're the one who controls the Black Sea. You're the one who's been stealing a lot of our agricultural output, who's been attacking our ports, who destroyed one of our primary ports in Mariupol, etc. So the Ukrainians are saying you are, by definition, blocking us from exporting the wheat because we can't guarantee the safety of our own ships, nor can we guarantee that those ships would even be able to do business in the way that they would normally be able to do. So there's a sort of cynical way that Putin is twisting this logic here. He says, oh, well, Russia doesn't block Ukrainian wheat. And more to the point, we will allow Ukrainian wheat to leave those ports and to go to the world markets if, by the way, the Ukrainians demine all of the harbors and all of the areas that they have mined. Naturally, the Ukrainians say not a chance because they know that any removal of those mines leads to the increased potential of some kind of an amphibious landing, a direct assault by Russian Marines, Russian naval forces, special forces, whatever it might be. Those mines, from the Ukrainian perspective, present a very real sort of security blanket, as it were. So, who's to blame? Are the Ukrainians to blame for having mined their own harbors in order to prevent an amphibious landing on one of their, well, two of their major ports? Or are the Russians to blame for suggesting that, hey, we're not really that interested in doing a deal with the Ukrainians unless they actually get rid of these mines? I think this is obvious. We have a stalemate when it comes to this issue. The Ukrainians can still sell wheat over land, sending exports westward to the European Union, etc. But for the global south, for all of those countries in Africa and in the Middle East and elsewhere that would be depending on these deliveries by ship, by across the Mediterranean, etc., this is a very real problem. Putin says that Russia is in constant contact with the relevant UN authorities. Well, I don't have any reason to doubt that they are, but the United Nations knows, and they've issued reports to this effect. They know perfectly well what Russia is responsible here for. That Russia has carried out ghastly atrocities and war crimes that have led us to this point. So just because the Russians aren't the ones who mine the harbors doesn't mean that somehow the Russians aren't culpable for all of this. Putin also makes another interesting claim that I happen to agree with to some extent. He says that part of the problem is not that Russia, excuse me, part of the problem is not that Russia is, blocking the export of fertilizers. It's that Western sanctions have directly targeted those companies that produce the fertilizer, because fertilizer production, as I'm sure everybody understands, is very much entwined with chemical production, the chemicals industry. Some of these key sectors of the Russian economy have been targeted by these sanctions. So Putin has a point in the sense that it's not just so simple for Russia to simply trade its fertilizer on the global markets now. They can't. Many countries that would want to buy Russian fertilizer can't buy Russian fertilizer because of the sanctions. And so, to some degree, Putin's right on that point. But again, we have to be very clear about understanding how he's sort of cynically weaponizing this aspect of it. He is saying essentially, well, if you didn't put sanctions on us, there would be no global food crisis. Okay, Vladdy, but if you didn't invade Ukraine, there would be no sanctions. So I mean, you know what I mean? I don't know if I need to explain further the fact that this is not this is not what we would call legitimate reasoning. This is self-interested twisting of the facts by Putin. Now, the final point I want to make about this, though, is that it's very easy for people to lose sight of the reality of this war, especially as it comes to this kind of grinding, sort of slow burning stage that it seems to be in now. But I guess the main takeaway I want people to have is that when we read these stories about a missile attack, about an attack on a gas platform or whatever, we have to see them as part of a broader picture. We have to see them as part of a continuous process of escalation, response to the response, etc. That these things are connected, that we are not, I think that people in the United States and in the West generally have a tendency to sort of see these things as discrete episodes. Another atrocity carried out by the Russians, another, crime carried out by Putin's forces or whatever. But we have to see that there is a logic to them, that there is a back and forth process happening, and that unfortunately this is the nature of war. And Putin has made very clear that Russia has no intention of ending this war anytime soon unless it is on their terms. That's part of the reason why I think it's inappropriate for people to chide Ukrainians for saying, well, we're going to fight until we win. Because the mentality has to be, to some extent, fight until you win, because if you don't, you will lose. And you and your family will end up 6 feet under. So there's an existential battle for survival for the people of Ukraine, irrespective of their politics, irrespective of the situation in any given town, city, or region. It is an existential war. And in fact, as we talk about this food issue, to some degree, it is becoming an existential conflict for governments around the world and for probably billions of people in the global south and elsewhere around the world. People want to put inflation and all of these other issues right on top of the Ukraine war. This is, I think, silly. There's a lot of reasons for why the West in general is facing inflation, but the Ukraine war exacerbates all of these, and we have to see how they're all connected. That's all I'm going to say for today. Thank you, as always, for the support. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. A lot more stuff there. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.